We have the biographer of Michael Brecker on the line, Bill Milkowski, Ode to a Tenor Titan, The Life and Times and Music of Michael Brecker. Bill, welcome to WPFW.
Hey, Rusty, how you doing? Thanks for having me on.
Oh, it's a pleasure. Boy, reading this book was like reading the music of my life, you know, in terms of how Michael got in to see John Coltrane when he was a teenager, when he was 17, you know.
Yeah.
It was an experience.
Yeah, a life-changing event for him.
Yeah, well, I saw Coltrane when I was 17 also in 1963 at Newport, and it was life-changing for me, although I'm not a musician. It certainly set the course of my life, I'll tell you. So tell us, you know, this was an incredible work that you put together, and, you know, why? Tell us why first.
Wow. Well, of course, Michael was just a profoundly gifted musician, prodigious technique. You know, just his sax playing alone was mind-blowing. And I'd been following his music since the early 70s, really, and got to know him personally over time. I grew up in Milwaukee, but I moved to New York in 1980 and began hanging out at 7th Avenue South, and had the occasion to interview him several times and got a friendship going with him. And of course, you know, his career, the narrative arc of his career was incredible. He really came to fruition as a composer on his album Wide Angles. And then at the peak of his creativity and his artistic output, and he's got a contented life in Hastings-on-Hudson with a wife and 2 kids, he gets hit by this horrible disease that nobody ever heard of or couldn't pronounce, you know, and it took his life. And I mean, it's just an incredible, dramatic story. It's a poignant story, and I wanted to tell his story, and by doing that, I went around and got really gripping testimonies from 100 different people, intimates, colleagues, friends, family, and it took me over the course of 2019 to gather those testimonies, and then I transcribed all the interviews and shaped it into a book in 2020, which was, you know, coincidentally when I would have, it was during lockdown, I would have been locked down anyway, working on this book 10 hours a day.
Wow.
You know, so this is, I had said this before, but the book was really my love letter to Mike, my admiration for his art, and also my personal friendship with him, which developed over time. You know, began with interviews, but it developed into something else over time, and it was just it's just so heart-wrenching to see him taken, and you know, it's like deja vu in a sense because of what happened with Ron Miles.
Absolutely. No, I mean,
another disease, another blood leukemia thing that no one's ever heard of and can't pronounce.
I know.
And it took him out. It took him away from us.
That was a real shock. You know,
beautiful, sweet, humble, immensely creative individual who was just taken.
I was reflecting on that as. You know, I saw Ron and spoke to him when he did the I Am a Man concert at the Kennedy Center a few years ago. It was just so moving in terms of how he, you know, took the incidents of Memphis of 1968 and put it into music, you know, and with his colleagues that he had. He was just a sweet guy.
Such an inspired cat, such a humble guy, just like Mike. You know, I did this book earlier. I think I was on your show maybe 25 years ago when the Jaco Pastorius book came out. Right. Mike and Jaco, of course, their careers sort of dovetail in a couple of different ways. First in Joni Mitchell's Shadows and Light tour in '79, and then also in Jaco's Word of Mouth band, which Mike played in. But, you know, they couldn't be more polar opposites.
Absolutely.
You know, Mike was so humble. He was unbelievably, I mean, jaw-droppingly gifted on his instrument, and legions and generations of sax players can attest to that. But he was self-deprecating at the same time and humble, and, you know, he'd do a solo in the studio and then apologize to the producer, "Oh, sorry, I'll do a better one."
Right.
You know, and meanwhile the guy has to pick his jaw off the ground.
No.
Right? And Jaco was the opposite. He would introduce himself to anybody in the early days, my name is Jaco Pastorius, I'm the greatest bass player in the world.
Right. No,
you couldn't imagine
contrast.
the polar opposites,
Absolutely.
and yet they were good friends too.
No, the personality of Michael is really reflected in your book, and and even though you don't insert yourself a whole lot, you do at sometimes mention interviews that you did and stuff. That personal relationship is certainly reflected throughout the book in terms of how you portray him, and. I was also intrigued, being familiar with him for I've been on the air for 53 years or something like that, and I'm familiar with his music, from the 70s onward, from him and his brother being with Horace Silver back in the early 70s,
right.
when I interviewed Horace, and but what was really fascinating to me was going back to even earlier years in the Philadelphia suburbs, like my longtime friend Mark Copeland being one of his friends from that period of time.
Right.
Or Eric Levat, who I knew here in D.C., was somebody who worked with him at such a young age. That was, really revelatory to me.
Yeah, Eric was a mentor for him. And Mark, of course, started off on alto sax. I think he played alto and tenor. There's a great picture in the book of the two of them in the high school band together in the sax section, wearing their suit and tie. But Mark lived not too far from the Breckers' home, and Mike and Randy grew up in a musical household. Their father was a really talented songwriter, he was a lawyer, but he also for the summer camp that they went to, they did kind of professional productions, and Bobby Brecker wrote music for it, along with another guy who went on to fame on Broadway, Moose Charlap, which is Bill Charlap's father.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm.
And so they had family jams in the living room. There was a B3 there, an organ, a set of drums. Bobby played piano and organ. Their sister Emily played piano, and Mark Copeland would come over and jam with them, or actually prepare music for, work on compositions and stuff. And he was the guy who really turned Mike on to Coltrane through a recording that he brought home, and had Mike come over and check this out. And it was mind blowing. And it wasn't long after that Mike saw Train live at Temple, which is the concert that Zev Feldman put out on Resonance a couple of years ago.
Yes, I remember. Boy, that was some concert.
He,
absolutely.
At some point in the concert, Train puts down his horn and he starts beating on his chest and singing.
Right. No,
he ran out of notes, so he went to the chest beating. And Mike was there as a 17-year-old kid, and it blew him away.
But his brother was already doing well on the trumpet, having moved onward around that time, right? So
what's interesting is Randy, being almost 4 years older than Mike, was already out of the house by the time Mike decided on becoming a musician. Randy had gone off to Indiana University, and as he told the story, at the time he split, he left the house and went to college. Mike was equally interested in music. He was playing clarinet, basketball. He was a super tall kid who was really good, and science. He had a chemistry set down in the basement. And Randy said, when he went off to college, he wasn't sure what Mike was going to commit himself to. And while Randy was gone, Mike developed. He switched to first alto sax when he was 15. He began taking lessons with Vince Trombetta in Philadelphia, who was a veteran on the scene and played in the house band at the Mike Douglas Show, which broadcast out of Philly. And he advised him, he's like, man, you don't sound like Phil Woods, you don't sound like Burr, you're sounding more like Train, you should switch to tenor.
Right.
So he started studying with him on tenor, and by the time Mike himself went to Indiana University, Randy was on the road with Horace. Mm-hmm. So again, their paths didn't cross, and it was when Michael's college band was in Chicago, sort of at a crash pad. They were they had been spotted at the Notre Dame Jazz Festival by a manager type who said, "Come to Chicago, I'll put you up in a house, I'll pay for your demo tape, we'll do this record with this band." It was actually Randy Sankey's band, the trumpeter.
Mm-hmm.
So they came to Chicago, and they stayed at this place for a month or so, and Horace's band rolled into town at the Plug Nickel, which happened to be right across the street from where those guys were crashing and preparing for their demo. So one day, Randy went over to check out Mike's band rehearsing, and he brought Cobham. Billy Cobham was in Horace's band, and Benny Maupin. And this was the first time that Randy heard Mike playing tenor.
Yes.
And it was like, oh my God, what?
My
that's
kid
my
brother.
Right, you know?
Right.
Because he had been gone for 3 years and didn't see the development. And he said Benny Maupin's jaw was on the ground.
Boy.
And so it was shortly after that Randy called Mike to come play on Randy's first recording, Score. They did it at Van Gelder's in 1969. Mike was 19 years old, and he came down from Indiana to do that recording. And shortly after, he ended up moving to New York and, beginning his journey in that city. And
so the 70s was an incredible time for the Brecker brothers doing their recordings together, having worked with Horace and then doing their own thing. And then there was the club, 7th Avenue South was the name of it, and the scene was, I remember the 70s. Or actually, there's some aspects of it I don't remember, in fact, because of
then that proves that you were there.
Right. But
listen, the thing that's fascinating to me, before the Brecker brothers, before Dreams, that great sort of jazz rock band that they formed with Cobham on drums and Abercrombie was on guitar, and Mike and Randy. Before that, there was a scene, a loft scene, that was focused around one building on 19th Street, where on the top floor was Dave Howland. No, that was Dave Liebman.
Mm-hmm.
And the middle floor, it was a 3-story building. Middle floor was Dave Howland, and the ground floor was Chick Corea. So these guys were jamming all the time. Liebman said that, people would call up from the street and he'd throw down the keys. They'd play for 6 hours, take a break, go to Chinatown, get something to eat, come back, play for 6 more hours. And it was like that because rents for those lofts were like $120 a month. And it allowed them to really experiment. And it was a free jazz scene pretty much. Steve Grossman was there. Mintzer, Mike, Randy, Liebman, Byrack, Bob Moses. And so they were really exploring a thing that you can't do today in New York. There's no apartment less than $2,000 a month.
You can't.
You could pay for 2,000 square feet, $120, and you do a couple of gigs and you got your month set, and the rest of the time you jam and you experiment. And Liebman was saying that it was like pretty much the North Star for them all was Train, specifically Latter-day Train, or more so like Ascension with 7 horn players in a rhythm section.
Right.
And that's where they were doing that before Dreams formed, and before they ended up getting Liebman went off with the group 10 Wheel Drive, and Mike and Randy joined Dreams, and they had a Columbia record deal. That was a band that had, it was fronted by two singer-songwriter guys, but it was definitely at the vanguard of Blood, Sweat, and Tears and Chicago, but way hipper in terms of soloing and horn arrangements. Barry Rogers, the trombone player, was a real key figure and a mentor to Mike and Randy. And, that was a precursor of things to come with the Brecker brothers. Of course, in between Dreams and the Brecker brothers, Mike and Randy went out with Cobham's own band after Mahavishnu. That was a great band. And Horace, that group with Horace, that was Will Lee on bass, Alvin Queen on drums,
mm-hmm.
and Horace. And That was a great band.
Boy, Alvin Queen asked me to do liner notes for an album. I'm looking forward to coming out. It was across the ocean correspondence. It was fascinating.
Oh, yeah, he's in Germany, is he?
No, where's he? He lives in Switzerland.
Okay, so does Cobham.
Right, wow.
Yeah.
But in any case, aspects of it, the music scene, the things that you get into in the book, like jingles. I mean, that's the day gig for musicians. They can make a good living,
and a lot that you would never expect. Yeah. A lot of cats that were playing at the Vanguard at night, and then in the afternoon, they're playing on Pepsi and Colgate commercials, But it's a means to an end. They were making money. They were very lucrative. And for Mike and Randy, having this tight connection, this almost telepathic brotherly hookup, they had a sound together, and a lot of people wanted that sound. So both of them appear on so many records in the horn section, all kinds of, from James Brown and T-Funk to Chaka Khan.
Beyond the commercials, all this backup that
all the commercials,
the backup work. But the other aspect, I
think Mike made the most money one year on a single Toyota commercial.
Oh,
it was like the most money from all the
nothing,
gigs.
And that aspect of music is gone.
Yeah,
musicians.
That was a scene in the 70s. It was very lucrative. Those guys were doing 3 sessions or more a day, and then playing at night. And of course, one would ask, well, when did they sleep? And
they didn't.
That's when the magic elixir of cocaine comes into play. Yes,
I was going to mention, here, this is, the era of coke.
Yeah.
But Michael gets a habit on heroin.
Yeah. And now going into this book, I say that I knew Mike well, very intimately, and as a pal, as well as the guy who interviewed him. I did not know anything about that heroin addiction. That was very surprising to me. And not only an addiction, but a decade-long addiction. From the time he came to New York to, he went into rehab at the end of 1981, was in for 5 weeks, and came out and was clean and sober for the rest of his life. And not only that, brought a lot of people, lots of musicians along with him, helped them get clean and sober. He sort of rededicated himself to living that clean and sober life, and remained so through the rest of his life. And really, so many people gave testimony about, he saved my life.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's another part of his
personality
story here.
Absolutely.
That he really turned it around and ended up saving a lot of people.
No, it was remarkable in terms of how he turned it around and worked on helping others in a very gentle way, so to speak. You really pull that out in terms of his personality. And there's so many things that in terms of Randy and I are the same age. And so I could see, in terms of looking at the life we were the youngsters. I'm not a musician, but I'm certainly the ultimate fan, and been connected to it on the radio and teaching and stuff like that, But the life experiences of being part of the life, drinking too much, was my drug of choice that I quit in 1983. And I just reflect on that going through this book. But what was also remarkable, we've already touched upon him being, on a lot of soul, R&B, and pop recordings. But the whole thing with Paul Simon was fascinating. Here's one of the most, big stars, most popular, and he's a little bit oblivious in a way to Paul's music, but gets pulled in because he's part of that scene.
Well, and it's funny because, of course, he played on. Still Crazy after all these years. He had played on some tunes, as a session guy. Not that he interacted so much with Paul on those things, but once he joined Paul's band, I remember the day that he was leaving. I was talking to him, and he's like, "Well, goodbye. I'll see you in a year and a half." Because those tours, his tour was literally a year and a half long. So he knew when he signed up what he was getting in for. And Paul didn't really. He's like one of the first things he said to Mike when Mike got in the band during rehearsals. He's like, "So what is this with Coltrane? I don't get it."
Right.
So not only did Mike not know Paul's music that well, Paul didn't know Mike's music that well or train, but Paul was really fascinated by the EWI, which of course is a bit of technology that Mike really innovated.
You anticipated my next question. Tell us about the EWI.
Yeah.
Capitals, EWI, the EWI.
Electronic Wind Instrument.
Right.
It's a MIDI triggering device. So, of course, the concept is that off of that wind-driven synthesizer, you can trigger, a vast array of sounds and textures. And of course, Randy once said that Mike approached his tenor and also, I would say, his EWI like a scientist. He analyzed it, he figured out how it could be done, and then figured out what can't be done theoretically and make it happen. So he came up with whole worlds of sound that was cool about this tour, that Paul gave him like 10 minutes where the band left the stage and he did these incredible, sonic environments where he would create like the rainforest with animals, and this is all coming from, he's triggering these sampled sounds off of his EWI, creating layers and thunder, and it was just amazing what he was able to do. He woodshedded on that instrument as deeply as he did on the tenor, which is saying a lot. It's almost you need two lives to do that. And Paul was gracious enough to really showcase Mike and his genius with that thing. He was just fascinated. Paul was fascinated by this new instrument, and he gave Mike the spot on that stage. And those big, they're playing stadiums. Of course, in New York they played at Central Park, and it was, I don't know how many thousands of people were in Central Park for that concert.
The other aspect of his life was he was a devoted family man. Married for decades, and a father to children who loved him. How did he balance all the touring with, that keeping the family together? I know economically working with Paul Simon does help a lot, but it's always the life of a musician being traveling and on the road that can put strains on marriages. A lot of right. Musicians, it really worked fine, and I could cite more musicians where it probably worked, but how did he balance that?
Well, the answer is Susan Brecker. I mean, She kept everything together. Mike was, essentially touring, gigging, and she was dealing with the day-to-day issues of taking care of little kids at first, and Mike was, of course, a great father, but he was gone for a year and a half on that tour with Paul Simon, and Susan was able to go on a couple of those gigs, and actually early on when they were dating, he went out and brought her along to some of the gigs in Asia and different places. But yeah, she was the rock of that relationship and kept things together for the whole family. And, she had mentioned to me that, she says, well, I'll forever be in Paul's debt, Paul Simon, because he paid for this house that we're sitting in, mm-hmm. and he paid for my kids' college education.
Excellent.
People were telling Mike, friends were telling Mike, don't do this gig. You got your own music, your career is taking off, you're creating all these compositions, you're going to put that on the back burner to go play, with this pop guy, and he knew what he was doing, and it was partly that foresight of being able to really buy this house in Westchester and have his kids go to college, and that was taken care of through that year-and-a-half tour with Paul Simon.
Tell us about the end.
Oh, man. Incredibly sad. Just, like I say, at the peak of his career, he's really artistically coming to a place. Early on when he was in the Brecker Brothers, Randy was the principal composer.
Mm-hmm.
Mike contributed a song here, a song there. Gradually, didn't feel confident about his writing. Was hesitant to show the rest of the band some of his compositions. But by the time we get to, of course, he came out with his own first album as a leader in 1987. At the, ripe old age of 38, he has his first album. He goes through a series of albums for the Impulse label, and by the time he comes to Wide Angles, which was with his Quindectet, his 15-piece band featuring a string section and a beautiful horn section, he's dealing in some deep waters compositionally, and his playing is so inspired. So at the peak of that, he's rising to these great levels. He's struck down by this disease. The specifics of it were he went out on a reunion tour for Steps Ahead. They did a mini tour of Japan. Mike Manieri and Mike Brecker. Steve Gadd on drums, Mike Stern on guitar. Darryl Jones was on bass, and then they also brought Adam Holtzman on keyboards. They did, I think it was Mount Fuji Festival and some other gigs, and it was at the Mount Fuji that they played an inspired set. It's actually on YouTube. You can see the entire concert, and that after the last tune, as they are taking their deep bows to the audience, a packed house at this giant stadium, Mike feels this incredible pain in his back. And he turns to Manieri. They were supposed to go off stage and come back and do an encore, but he tells Manieri, I think I broke my back.
Mm-hmm.
I can't go back on. So they didn't, and the band stayed that night. Mike went back to New York, and shortly after got diagnosed with this myelodysplastic syndrome, which is a sort of a blood leukemia thing. And of course, that was shocking, and he went about trying to find a cure, which was a bone marrow transplant. There was an international search for a donor to get an exact match to do this bone marrow transplant. Because he is Ashkenazi, his background is genetic background. They did a intense search through Israel at the Red Sea Jazz Festival. They had donor tents where people were, applying for the bone marrow registry, and also at Michael's childhood synagogue in Cheltenham, the suburban Philadelphia place where he grew up. And what came out of it is they didn't find a match around the whole world.
No,
he ended up getting a half match from his own daughter, Jessica.
Yeah.
And that sustained his life force enough to live another 6 months after that surgery. And that's what allowed him to come back and make his swan song pilgrimage, which, he literally got off a deathbed to make that record. It's so heroic and triumphant.
I have it queued up, in fact, and what I have queued up is "When Can I Kiss You Again?"
Yeah,
that
was named for his. That was a phrase that his little son, Sam, said to him when he was in the hospital, and he was, going through chemo, and they had to wear masks, and he couldn't, "Daddy, when can I kiss you again?" Yeah. So he wrote that song about that incident. Sam now is a police officer in Hastings-on-Hudson. He's, also like maybe 6'2", and he's very handsome, just like Mike, and tall, very incredible-looking guy. He's a police officer.
I have to remind folks that you're listening to WPFW 89.3 in Washington. I'm Rusty Hassan, and my guest is Bill Milkowski, the author of Ode to a Tenor Titan, The Life and Times and Music of Michael Brecker. Bill, how can people obtain this incredible book?
Well, I have a website where I'm actually selling signed copies. That's just BillMilkowski.com. But it's also, of course, available through Amazon.com. And, I don't know if bookstores exist anymore.
Yeah, they do. We have some good independent stores here in D.C., you know, so we're good. We're good for that.
I remember when I did that thing with you in D.C., it was at a bookstore, and you interviewed me. This was when my Jocko book came out.
Absolute boy.
95 it was.
Jeez, boy,
so
it's been
here we are, 27 years later.
Right. Bill, I want to thank you for thinking of me and getting me the book so we can do this interview. It's been a real pleasure talking to you. And
great, Rusty.
Got some more Michael Brecker queued up, but I'm going to play from this last piece, and it's quite a lineup that he gathered for this final record. Pat Metheny, a longtime partner of his on guitar, Herbie Hancock piano, Brad Naldo also on piano on the day, John Patitucci, and Jack DeJohnette.
Right.
And we'll have some more Michael Brecker to conclude the show. I got some other artists to cover, but from Pilgrimage, Bill Milkowski, thank you so much for calling in tonight.
Great, Rusty. Carry on, man.
Absolutely.
You're the man in D.C., that's for sure.
Well, thanks a lot. Thank you much.